Summary of Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. The grand and historical Audley court is in bad shape. Sir Michael Audley, a kind and rich old bachelor, and his wilful daughter Alicia, who is 18 years old, make their home in the majestic Essex estate, which has hidden tunnels and a quiet grove. Lucy Graham moves to the town near Audley Court to work as a governess for Mrs. Dawson. No one knows much about her past, but everyone in the neighborhood likes how nice she is and how pretty she looks. Sir Michael falls in love with Lucy quickly and starts to court her, thinking that if she loves him back, it will be because of the purity of his love and not because of his money. When he asks Lucy to marry him, he tells her to forget about money and only think about how she feels about him as a person. She says she can't do that because she was raised in poverty and that will always affect her. Still, the two agree to get married. Alice doesn't like that her new wife is young. After looking for his wealth in Australia for 3.5 years, George Talboys goes back to England. He wants to see his kid and wife again, who he left because he couldn't support them. Back at Audley Court, Phoebe Marks, the plain maidservant of Lady Audley, talks to her cousin and fiancé, Luke Marks, about how spoiled Lady Audley is. The couple goes through Lady Audley's room and finds a shoe from a baby and a lock of hair. Phoebe starts to think of a way to get Luke to give her money so she can open a pub. Sir Michael's nephew Robert Audley is lazy and doesn't care about much. Even though Robert is a lawyer, he doesn't care much about his job. George, an old friend from school, tells Robert about his search for his wife Helen when they run into each other. They find a newspaper with the news that she had recently died. George is upset, so the two men go to see Lieutenant Maldon, George's father-in-law, who confirms that George's wife is dead. When George leaves, he makes Robert little Georgie's formal guardian. Little Georgie is living with Maldon. Even after a year, George still feels terrible about his wife. He and Robert go to Audley Court to see Lady Audley, but she keeps making up reasons not to meet them. In the end, Robert and George stop by while Lady Audley and Sir Michael are away. They do this in response to a letter Lady Audley got from Mrs. Vincent, her old boss who is dying. In their absence, Alicia shows George and Robert a secret tunnel into Lady Audley's private rooms, where they see a portrait of the lady. After that, George seems upset, but Robert thinks it's because he's scared of the storm outside. The next day, George leaves without telling Robert anything. When Robert goes to Audley Court, he finds out that George was there for a short time but hasn't been seen since. Robert worries about his friend. Robert asks Lieutenant Maldon if he has seen George by going to him. Maldon says that George came to see him the night before, but then he left for Australia. Robert finds a half-burned letter in the fireplace. It seems to say the same thing that Maldon just said. Robert goes to Liverpool, but when he looks at the guest lists of recent ships, he can't find George's name. He starts to worry that George never left England and may be dead, so he makes a list of all the strange things about George's absence. Back at Audley Court, Lady Audley gives money to Phoebe and Luke Marks so they can get married and open a pub. Luke tells Lady Audley that she will give them a lot more, which sounds like he is now trying to force her to do what he wants. He and Phoebe use their new money to buy the Castle Inn, an ugly, drafty house. When hunting season starts, Robert and a group of other single men come to Audley Court. Robert doesn't like hunting, so he stays inside and talks with Lady Audley about what he thinks happened to George. Sir Towers, another bachelor, asks Alicia to marry him, but she says no because she loves Robert. Lady Audley tells Sir Michael that Robert has to leave their home because he gives his young aunt too much care. Then, Robert gets a room at the Castle Inn. Lady Audley comes to see him and asks how his search for George is going. Robert says he wants to look over George's old letters. Robert finds out soon after that Lady Audley has left for London. When Robert goes back to his home in London, he finds that none of George's letters, including the ones Helen wrote to him, are there. Robert finds a few books that George forgot to take with him. One of the books has writing by Helen in it. When he sees the writing, he realizes something terrible that he doesn't want to think about. Robert goes to Malden's house and talks to him about the message that was burned. Malden weeps and looks so sad. Robert doesn't ask him any more questions. Robert takes George's son out of the house and puts him in a boarding school. Robert feels sad about the bad things he's looking into, so he makes a deal. He'll only keep looking into them if George's father, Mr. Harcourt Talboys, says it's okay. Harcourt has a firm, harsh view of justice, and he rejected his son because he married someone from a lower class than the family. Robert can't get Harcourt to care about his son going missing, so he leaves the Talboys' house, happy that his investigation is over. As Robert is leaving, Clara, George's sister, stops him. Clara asks Robert to kill the man who killed her brother. Her desire makes her look even more beautiful, which convinces Robert to keep looking into things. Shortly after that, Robert gets a letter for Alicia that says Sir Michael is sick and wants to see him. When Robert goes back to Audley Court, he asks Dr. Dawson about Lady Audley, who used to work for him. Dawson says he doesn't know anything about her except that Mrs. Vincent told him she was good. Robert finds Mrs. Vincent, who tells him that she doesn't know much about Lucy Graham's past. She also says that she wasn't really dying last year and that she didn't send a message to Lucy. Her other worker, Miss Tonks, on the other hand, knows for sure when Lucy came to their school. Miss Tonks also lets Robert look in Lucy's trunk, where he finds a label with her name on it stuck on top of another label. He takes off the top label and, based on what he sees, comes to the conclusion that George's wife and Sir Michael's wife are the same person. Robert goes to the place where Helen Talboys grew up because this news makes him feel bad. There, he meets Mrs. Barkham, the Malden's landlord, who gives him letters that Helen wrote to her father. Helen says in these letters that she has to leave her old life behind, and she talks about a secret reason that only her father knows about. Robert stops at a nearby church on his way back to Audley Court. There, he meets Clara. He tells her that he thinks he knows who killed George, but he doesn't want to name a suspect until he's sure. Then, Robert goes to see Lady Audley and tells her everything he knows, but he doesn't accuse her of murdering anyone. He says that the woman who killed George should leave the country so he doesn't have to tell the terrible truth. Lady Audley told him he was crazy and that he couldn't accuse her. Robert leaves, and Lady Audley tries to convince Alicia and Sir Michael that Robert has gone crazy. That night, Lady Audley sits by herself and thinks about how she looks. She thinks about how, at a young age, she understood that her beauty could help her get what she wanted. She thinks about Robert's claims and decides that the only way to stop him is to kill her. Just then, Phoebe Marks came to tell her that Robert was staying at the Castle Inn and that Luke would tell Robert her secrets if Lady Audley didn't pay the Marks' rent. Phoebe says that she wishes Luke would leave the pub because he gets so drunk and careless there that she worries they might get burned in their beds. Phoebe gives Lady Audley a letter from Robert. It says that if Helen Talboys is still living, Robert will bring Mrs. Barkham to identify her. Lady Audley tells Phoebe to take her to the Castle Inn so she can pay the owner herself. Lady Audley says she feels dizzy when they get there, so she goes inside to get some water. Lady Audley double locks Robert's room and puts a lit light very close to some curtains while she is in there. As Phoebe and Lady Audley leave the inn, Phoebe sees the fire and says that Lady Audley started it. The next morning, Lady Audley chats with Sir Michael and Alicia and then says she feels sick and needs to lie down. After a long sleep, she asks Alicia to join her for a walk on the grounds of the house. They meet Robert, who tells them that he didn't sleep in his room at the inn the night before because he is a light sleeper and woke up before the fire could get him. No one died in the fire, but Luke got hurt very badly. Since the Markses told him that Lady Audley started the fire, Robert will no longer be kind to her and will tell everyone all of her secrets. Lady Audley tells Robert to go get Sir Michael because she is going to confess. She says that she has gone crazy and that she killed George because he drove her crazy. When Sir Michael comes in, she tells him about her life, starting with how she found out that her own mother had been locked up for being crazy. She talks about how she married George and how living in poverty drove her crazy. She then talks about how she gave up her child and her old life, married Sir Michael for his standing and money, and faked her own death by using the body of Mrs. Plowson's daughter. Sir Michael is devastated by what she said. Robert gets Alicia to agree to leave with Sir Michael, and then he calls a doctor. Dr. Musgrave shows up and decides that Lady Audley is not crazy, but she does have mania when she's under a lot of stress, which makes her dangerous. He gives Robert a letter that Lady Audley can use to get into a Belgian hospital under a fake name. Before she leaves, she gets mad and tells him that she pushed George into an old well on the grounds of Audley Court, where he died. Robert goes back to Essex to see Luke because he is sad about what happened to George. Luke tells Robert that he found George still living right after Lady Audley tried to kill him. He took George home and fixed him there. George said he was going to sail to Australia and left. Robert asks Clara to marry him so they can go to Australia to look for George together. George goes back to London before they can leave, but she says yes. He was in New York, but he came back because he missed his best friend Robert. After 2 years, Robert has made a good living as a lawyer. He lives with his wife Clara, their baby son, and George Talboys. Little Georgie often visits them after school. Sir Towers' proposal to Alicia has finally been accepted, Sir Michael has moved out, and Audley Court is now empty. Lady Audley got sick in the Belgium hospital and died there. So, everyone is happy at the end of the story.
About the author. Mary Elizabeth Braddon was born in London to Henry Braddon, a lawyer and writer, and Fanny White, an Irish woman. When Mary was only 5 years old, her parents' marriage ended because Henry was unfaithful and didn't take care of money. Mary started acting in 1857 to make money for herself and her mother. 3 years later, her first book came out, and she met the editor, John Maxwell. She had an affair with Maxwell, whose wife was already married and lived in an asylum. In 1862, they had their first child together. In the same year, she had her first commercial success with Lady Audley's Secret. Braddon wrote a lot of books over the course of her life and started her own literary magazine, Belgravia, which was all about sensation fiction. When Maxwell's first wife died in 1874, they were finally able to get married. Together, they had 6 children.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.